Hey, Brian. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
How's it going in New Mexico?
Well, a little crisp this morning. We had some rain over the past couple days, and so
Nice.
everything's looking very juiced from that. So that's
Good.
cool.
Yeah, I was a little worried about fire season out there this year. Um,
I think we're
so
doing the El Nino thing, so hopefully we'll stay moist
okay,
for fire season. Yeah.
good. I have kind of like a weird topic. So so we'll see if this goes anywhere. Um, I
Okay.
was listening to Steve McIntosh. You might have come across him. He's kind of in the developmental philosophy world, and he has like critiques of integral theory and Ken Wilber. I guess they worked together for some time in Boulder.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and one of the things that he said about evolution is that it seems to be that um, that it happens from the middle. Um, so meaning that um, at a very small scale, atoms, say, or at a very large scale, galaxies, consciousness doesn't seem to emerge, but in the middle, it does. Or at least whether it seems to emerge or not, it has emerged. And that got me like, that's just kind of been stuck in my head. I don't really know what to do with that, but it got me thinking about shapes. And we've had conversation about shapes um, over the years, like the vertical and horizontal aspect of the cross. Or there was a period, I don't know if you remember this, maybe like 15 years ago, where you were really jazzed about the idea of the torus shape and what it represents. And so th- there seem to be shapes that have like significance or have had significance through cultures and that have layers of meanings. And so, kind of, this idea of consciousness emerging at the middle of the scale made me think of like a Taurian kind of shape. And so, my topic for you today, if I don't know if this is enough of a pitch for you to get a swing on, is w- like, what about shapes and what comes up for you around this idea of the importance of the middle of the scale being where emergence happens.
Yeah. I think that's mistaken. Without hearing his argument.
Fair.
And the reason that I think it's mistaken is because I think the nature of this is that it's like you can always see from where you are back down the ladder, but I don't think you can see up the ladder. And the reason that this looks like the pinnacle of consciousness in the universe is because our brain is not complete, because we just can't pick up those radio stations that represent higher consciousness without some key dispositional shift that I would suggest Mr. McIntosh has not gone through if he's making such an argument. Um, this is the idea that life happens in what physicists refer to as the zone of middle dimensions. It could be that I can see the argument from that side. It's just that, see, this is this this materialist idea that consciousness can only happen if it's resting on matter, and that somehow we seem to be at the pinnacle of that in this test tube. Uh,
I
I
just want to
don't
be
know that.
careful that I'm sure I have not done Steve McIntosh justice, and so I don't want to. So feel free to educate me about this topic, but let's not throw him under the bus too quickly because
Right.
he's much better
I haven't
informed
heard
on this
his
than I am.
argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have to steel man it for myself just from that one proposition. And I can see the logic of how one would end up there, but also from my seat, it seems like saying that the seat at the record player table is the highest level that consciousness will ever attain, and that there isn't the possibility of moving into that third dimension, looking down and seeing, which is a fundamentally cynical worldview. And whether Mr. McIntosh takes that viewpoint or not, certainly plenty of other people do. And they take it on as an ontology. And like this is the nature of being somehow. And my that's all yeah, that only makes sense if matter has primacy over consciousness. I don't see how you could make that argument if you have a consciousness first viewpoint. Uh because this is like it's like saying, well, there's the ladder that goes up and the ladder that goes down, but the most significant place is in the middle. And that's not really the way that ladders work. Right? Which is why we choose that idea of a staircase, uh, or a ladder if we're Finnegan and we're falling down it or carrying the hod up it. Uh, but the one thing that we rarely do with a ladder is stop in the middle. If we need to, we get a shorter ladder, right? In other words, and maybe this is stretching this analogy a little bit too far, but it seems to me kind of presumptuous to say that consciousness has reached its pinnacle in the formation of individual primates. I mean, if I say it that way, it should sound a little askew. Uh, it seems to me that we don't really have enough information to say anything with certainty. When I use the word certainty, I weight that a lot. Uh, for those folks that like to listen to books, we're currently in the middle of a quest for or the quest for certainty by John Dewey, who is talking about this process of knowledge and what do we think is the most important things to know. And because, his is an exploration of the relationship between knowledge and action. So I just have to look at, as an eclectic and somewhat of a synthetic, as opposed to analytic, type of having that penchant. And from my own personal experience, higher consciousness is is a thing. And it is accessible, though I don't think it's easily accessible. And I think that's part of the problem. For example, people are talking now about, uh, I've been watching these translations of Sumerian tablets that now I guess AI is helping speed things up because translating Sumerian is not a thing most people do. And there is this idea that, these higher beings were engineering humans and that they specifically put in a thing to prevent the pineal gland, is usually what they're pointing to, from functioning completely. As if that, and this kind of plugs into Genesis. Why shouldn't humans have knowledge of good and evil? Well, animals don't have knowledge of good and evil. Maybe this is an uplift story, right? Uh, but so this idea, it just dovetails in also with Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson by Gurdjieff, where Beelzebub says, there was installed in these humans the organ Kunda buffer. One of the things that I can tell you is that in the normal human energetic state, that higher level of consciousness is not accessible. only with a systemic energetic shift that puts energy in places where energy does not normally go in the course of normal human life does another level of consciousness unfold. I can say I've only, as I've said before, I've only had my toes on the threshold uh, from sorties in that liminal space, enough to say that consciousness extends up to where I can't open up to it. So that's just a complete refutation of that theory based on a non-verifiable phenomena that I personally experience. So, y'all think whatever you want, but I'm kind of being empirical in this without escaping the fact that there's a lot of interpretation there. Like I've said in my experience of this liminal space, my toes on the threshold experience, it was not God saying, I am the highest level of Buddha, or I am, the God of the Bhagavad Gita, or the God of Abraham and Isaac, or that none of those things. None of that made sense up there. The communication was more like, this is it. All the definitions below that are all relevant in a different disposition, but not in this one, if you will. So this is why my Zen master said, the world of God is wonderful, but in the world of God, there are no bathrooms and no restaurants. We are tuned in one way for everyday life. If we follow Bergson, we'd say to make things, right? Which is sort of very harmonious with Dewey, who Dewey did, in fact, in our last reading, reference Bergson and creative evolution. Uh, but even Bergson with creative evolution gives us this idea that elan vital, this urge or thrust towards unfolding life, is something beyond our little picture of how our brain works, which slices up the pepperoni of time. Check out that episode, folks, so that we can metabolize it in our disposition of being here to make things and to make mostly bathrooms and restaurants, or variations on the theme with the occasional Lamborghini or Ferrari thrown in there. But yeah, one could argue that those still fall into the category of the restaurant, you know. So that is something I need to put inside of me from the outside, or somehow, some experience, some transcendent, some new thing to move me to a new place. What's it going to be? And I look to stuff. Obviously, that new cell phone will do it, right? Or, uh, you know, everything that people come up with, like literally all of culture. This was one of Ken Wilber mentioning uh, integral theory. One of his first books was called The Atman Project. And basically, the premise is that what humans really want is union with this higher dimension of consciousness. But since we don't have that circuit open because of that pesky Kunda buffer, right, which is the Kund from Kundalini, the energy that rises up, and the buffer from the buffer it, prevent it from getting there. That's that dreaded organ Kunda buffer. And boy, if you want to read a unique book, I've recommended over our series quite a few unique books. Well, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson is not like a normal book. It's worth checking
Isn't
out
there
if you're into
some
unusual things.
isn't there some drama around Gurdjieff? I think I've heard some really negative things about him. I don't know if that qualifies as writing at all, but what was his deal?
Well, Gurdjieff, that's a great question. He's one of the presenters, if not a cooker upper of the Enneagram. And, he traveled around a lot, hence his second book called Meetings with Remarkable Men, which is much more normal of a book. Like, don't think all of Gurdjieff's writings are as unique as Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which is in 3 volumes. Um, and he tells you, you're gonna need to read this 3 times. This is the first time is you just read it, like you read a newspaper, and then the second or read it out loud, maybe, he says, and the second time, only the 3rd time should you try to really get what I'm talking about here. And I have to confess, I have not read it 3 times. But reading it once is enough to tell you that there's things that are going on of an analogical nature. Uh, but and again, another book that I'm currently in the middle of is a book that was compiled of lectures by Jan Cox, who I've referred to before. Jan is the one who we swiped the metaphor of being born with your foot nailed down in a
Yeah.
room in a house, and
Yeah, I watched a couple of YouTube videos of him speaking. Really interesting guy.
yeah, and in this current book called Gates of Man, it's all about what he calls this thing, capital T's, uh, which is what they used to call the great work in various white magical or alchemical traditions. Is this what do you do to attain another disposition? Uh, and this is where he has to, he talks about this a lot, and the whole story is that you need to move energy into a new place to get a new consciousness. Is this my paraphrasing a complicated series of lectures where nothing's ever stated? He says, here are maps, but no maps are ever accurate. So, just as we've said, the act of mapping is the act of leaving out details. Uh, or choosing details, and they're by effect leaving out everything not chosen. And, but so I think that that's where we get this idea of us being in the middle. Just saying that we're in the middle, uh, he's willing to give dimensions to matter. Again, this might be a straw man, a straw Macintosh, but uh, if he's willing to give dimensions beyond to matter, but he isn't willing to give that to consciousness. To me, that's like why one wouldn't be troubled by that mismatch. Why one I mean, because a lot of the texts that we've looked at coming from quasi-mystical sources of people who have attained a different disposition, if we allow them that assumption, uh, one of the things that they tell us, again, going back to chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching, is that these 2 things, stuff and matter, right, or absolute reality and contingent reality, we give them different names, but they are one. That's basically what the Tao Te Ching. Let me see how the direct quote here. Just happened to have it. These two, the secret and its manifestations, are in their nature the same. They're given different names when they become manifest. They may both be called the cosmic mystery. And there are different translations of that unfold that. Maybe we'll go into that, if we do a reading. Our episode with Dr. David Marshall on the Tao Te Ching seemed to be well received. So that might be a hole worth digging deeper.
Yeah.
Maybe just the text, not necessarily with Dr. Marshall, um, but so this is a regular theme. This is not the only place this shows up. This is what Spinoza's talking about, I think.
When he
When
talks about nature as God.
yeah, and as substance, as the underlying, the substance, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That that
Epistance. The which I always associate with quantum potential. At least until I hear a better physics explanation for it. But I think that's what David Bohm was intuiting. That the potential for things to happen, transforming into things actually happening, is a creative force, is a conscious force.
That's Elan Vital
Yeah.
for Bergson, and that's why he's so against the the chopping up of the pepperoni, because it's in his concept of time they call durée, that it's in this duration that this unfolding and this manifesting happens. But the idea that, I mean, it's just such a fundamental misunderstanding of ontology that that obviously the universe bigger than humans, the larger dimensions of things, is not lawless. It's not just complete chaos and lawlessness at larger scales. It follows laws. There is a logos there, in other words. The
You're not
ancients
referring to
saw
the
a
laws of physics.
regularity.
You're not referring to the
Pardon?
laws of physics. You mean something different.
Well, I think the laws of physics suffice for my argument,
Okay, okay.
and that is that they are a manifestation of meaning, of logos,
Of order.
of the secret. Yeah, or cosmology. Cosmos is the Greek word for order.
So
So,
are you saying in a way that if there were no, laws of physics, that or that the fact that the universe follows laws of physics is evidence of order, and order is evidence of consciousness?
that's a version of the argument that I would make. I would say that logos extends all the way up, all the way down, through the turtles, all the way down. And
Beyond
that
the turtles.
yeah, and uh that you have to go on. Now, maybe when consciousness goes beyond a human mind, maybe they want to give it another definition. Maybe they want to create another word for that. And then you can say, okay, well, consciousness, wink, wink, human consciousness and then when it gets beyond us, we want to call it something else, so super consciousness or the mind of God or logos. But the idea that human consciousness is the pinnacle is myopic hubris. And
I
I
really don't
think
know
there's
if
evidence that's just not right.
I think it's just as likely that, well, maybe going back to my weird question about shapes, um,
Uh-huh.
the the image that I have is human consciousness being a sort of dimple outgrowth, um, meeting up with the ends of the scales, right? So it's like this, um, kind of torus shape, and that's what made me think of, I don't remember what you were going off about 15 years ago, or what, maybe even 20 years ago, where there was like a week straight where that's like what was on your mind. And I don't
Yeah, yeah.
remember like the significance of that. Maybe
Oh,
let's bring that back in, and because I feel like there's a
yeah.
connection here.
Well, the torus seems to be the way that energy wants to move under certain conditions. And for folks who aren't familiar with the sexy word torus, you can also substitute in the word donut, uh, capital D, let's say. So,
Important donut.
yeah. So for example, a lot of movements within internal arts will rise up the center, fall down the outside, or come up the outside, move down the center, although that's not quite as common. Uh, but you can see what are those are going to be involved with. They're going to be involved with energy moving up, energy moving down, energy moving from the inside, energy moving to the outside, right? Well, in Chinese medicine, they have this idea they call the chi mechanism. One of my teachers, he said, his teacher, I've referred to this before, his teacher who didn't have a lot of English, he told him, and I try to quote directly, chi mechanism very simple. In, out, up, down, right? So we have these moves, one very, well-known move they call wave hands like clowns. And it's said that within these circles, you have in towards you, you have out away from you, you have rising, you have falling. And so, another one of my teachers, somebody said, if you could only do one move, what would you do? And he said, wave hands like clouds. Because, in fact, he taught a 10-week course that at the end of the 10 weeks, you had that move. I have another buddy who was a Tai Chi teacher for a lot of years, wrote a whole book on that move, wave hands like clouds.
The 10-week course, did it include the stepping like Chen style, or was it
No
the Wu
stepping.
style with
No
the hands
stepping.
with the feet static?
Not only does it in the long curriculum, not only does it not have stepping, but before you get to that, you usually do 10 weeks of just standing,
Yeah.
not even any moving, right? So literally starting at stillness, but organizing. Turns out that in trying to get that initial stillness, there's a lot of movements that have to be dealt with and that stabilize and organize the alignments of the body. But
It
so this idea of the torus, it handles those four: in, out, up, down. It's the way those four naturally relate in a cycle, right? Which is a constant. Now, if this is sounding familiar to you, get a magnet, put it under a piece of cardboard, throw a bunch of iron filings down, and the plane of the paper or the cardboard will show you in the iron filings a cross section, which is going to look like a donut sliced in half. So you see the rotation, and where the magnet is will be one, part of the current, and then the rest of it will move down around and it'll come right back, connecting the positive and the negative poles, which I've mentioned before. In the human nervous system, we have that same deal, which is related to the difference between standing meditations and sitting meditations. So the poles are more separate. So there's a greater differential. So you need more charge to arc. Okay. So, but all those are based on the way energy moves in the human body, which has to do with up the back, down the front, up the back, down the front. Uh, so how that would relate to the universe, I mean, maybe the whole universe is doing that on some level, or uh,
it kind of
I
it
think
has
it
that.
shows up most in magnetic fields, and since we're kind of working with a bioenergy, it's natural that it would work along those lines. You
It reminds me of, the Fibonacci series, right? Kind of the golden ratio and how that shows up everywhere. I imagine this kind of Taurian movement of energy shows up in a lot of places, like, in how, um, yeah, I don't know. I would just be
Well,
speculating.
probably wherever you have a hole that has a magnetic field, which is to say anything that's alive is gonna have an electromagnetic field, and that electromagnetic field is gonna have a certain current or flow that moves through it. And so that means there's gonna be a positive and there's gonna be a negative, and there's gonna be movement between those. And that's where the torus comes from, basically.
So let me pound on the other end of this topic again a little.
Uh-huh.
So if we say something like only living things have well, that's not true, but magnetic fields are found in living things. Um, Other things are unique to living things. I think there are 7 qualities, right, that determine whether something is living or not, and fire and viruses both hit 5 or 6 of the 7, but don't quite nail it.
Uh-huh.
Um, why do we assume consciousness is not only associated with living things? When we punch through to a higher level of consciousness and realize this is it, um, uh, w- even if we experience um, all of nature, Spinoza style, as a field that is organized. The fact that we're aware of it and uh, and things that are not conscious are not aware of it. Why doesn't that justify locating consciousness in awareness? Why does it? Why does it? Why do we assume it would be located beyond awareness?
Well, I think that I don't know that we have to assume that. I would say that unconscious things might not be the locus of awareness. Here's a question for you. If we have a beehive, is the beehive one consciousness, or does each individual bee have consciousness? Is the answer one, the other, or both? If there is a hive consciousness, then maybe the locus of hive consciousness resides in the queen, or maybe it has no locus apart from the collective, but it makes decisions in effect that trump the decisions of the individual bee. The individual bee is a sacrificial straw dog, to quote chapter 5 of the Tao Te Ching. So, and I've been sort of well, again, coming out of Jan Cox's book, there's a way that certain things look in one disposition, and the way that they look is different from a different disposition. And uh, the I take I used to take when I was in my trusting others phase. I used to take what William James wrote an entire book about, the varieties of religious experience. But what's interesting in that book, which maybe we'll do that or part of that as one of our readings because it's kind of unique in the field. But what's unique about that is not the varieties, it's the samenesses within that variety. And he lists, I think, 4 qualities. Uh, Unpredictability, like you can't just make it happen. It turns out maybe you can, but it's certainly not direct and easy. This would be like, a meditative lineage that actually is intact and has every step covered. Uh, you might, it has ineffability as a quality, which is to say that you can't explain it. It transcends words, which is a good sign that you're moving into a new dispositional condition. It also has what he terms noetic quality, and that is that it bears its own authority within the experience. And, maybe the closest thing that most people might have, I don't know that there is an experience that most people might have around that actually. Uh,
Well, I'm not
the
sure
ex
what that means. Bears its own authority within the experience means it's subjective. You just have to accept it for what it is. Is that what it means?
It means that the impression on the individual having it goes far beyond subjectivity, but it's not because it's inevitable, you can't pass it along propositionally. Doesn't mean you can prove it to anybody else, and that's the hitch. That's really been the
What do you mean
problem.
by far beyond subjectivity? Like like beyond subjectivity is reality, but ineffably so. Is that
Yeah,
what you
pretty
mean?
much.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah, it presents itself "this is it" is self-evident
yeah, yeah.
somehow.
Well, somehow um, I think
The
this is
devil's in
where,
that somehow.
yeah, this is where we get into trouble. Um,
Well, see,
I,
the thing is when sages have these so-called religious experiences, they typically don't walk away from it going, maybe, maybe not.
Right. It's self-evident. No, I know.
That's
I've had a
noetic
little
quality
taste.
right there.
I've had a little taste of that,
Yeah.
and know what you're speaking of.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's what makes a dispositional shift absolutely essential if you're not doing the trusting others path, but you're trying to do the myself power path. For those new listeners, this is a distinction in Japanese Buddhism. Zen, where you're trying to strike your own realization, is considered a myself power. It's Jiriki and there's Tariki. And I think it's Jiriki is the myself power and Tariki is trusting others. Yeah, if that's not right, I'll put it up here. Uh,
is that about, like, the tension between the individual and the collective? Or maybe say more about what trusting others means.
well, trusting others means that some sage who has had the experience himself says, okay, recite this
Got it.
mantra and it's going to get you credit in another realm. And you don't experience any of that. You're just sitting there reciting the mantra. You don't know that your spiritual quality has changed by this at all, but you're trusting that they said, well, put the Maitreya Buddha on your side, or this when you die, then the Virgin Mary will come and help you. Or, now if you've had your own experience that had that noetic quality that we're talking about, then maybe you've transcended that barrier between trusting others and myself and power. For example, when someone starts learning kung fu with me, I say, okay, you're going to have to do this. It's not obvious how that to them, maybe, it might not be obvious how that's going to build a quality that they're going to need later when we get the whole structure up.
Wax on, wax off.
So, so you have to trust your teacher. And, what do you do? How do you test the teacher? Uh, you have your own compass. You have your own karma, which means there might be certain kinds of wooden nickels you really want to take.
Mm.
And that makes you pray for false teachers, right? Uh, but basically, you have to see when I look at this person and when the rubber meets the road, do they manifest the qualities that should come from higher awareness? Which is a very slippery slope. This is one of the things where famous stories about Gurdjieff, right? Gurdjieff had a group, and the group were supposedly all people that were dedicated to this work. And there was one person in this group that just irritated everybody. So Gurdjieff leaves for some purpose, comes back, and he finds out that when he was gone, all the people they just berated this person so much that this person decided to leave. And Gurdjieff was so bummed about this. This was so not according to his plan. He supposedly ran down and caught the guy at the train station and paid him money to make him stay. And the story was supposedly that this is another important realization. This guy was like the agitator ball in the can of paint. And, for example, this is something we've talked about a lot conflict. We tend to have this idea. I think of the song Heaven, Talking Heads. Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. With this idea that the ideal life with all the problems solved, would be completely without conflict. And in fact, from a higher viewpoint, from this extra energized perspective above the table, you can see that there's nothing wrong. There's no problem. This is one of the things that Jan Cox has been pounding in this book, that from the viewpoint of reality, everything is unfolding exactly as it should, according to laws that mean it could happen in no other way. And in that, yes, people and things are like sacrificial straw dogs, and that's okay. The Bhagavad Gita says, pretty much the same thing. But we can't get to that viewpoint without a major dispositional shift. We will always be in the this or that world. One of the things that I tried to do with the, uh, the treatment that we did about the brouhaha around the Odyssey was to actually demonstrate we've got the horns of a dilemma, the 2 sides of the argument, and I tried to show how a third viewpoint puts creates a landscape that both of those sides fit into and show how they belong to each other. How you will you this can't manifest without both of those sides manifesting, because that's the way it is in the world of stuff. That dynamic tension between 2 sides actually maybe tends to mask. This is another Jan Cox's point. He says, in ordinary consciousness, we see these 2 forces, but it's really a triple setup. But that third force, we can't see it. But that if we could reside in that third force, which by Hegel would be synthesis, as opposed to thesis and antithesis, which are the 2 opposites pulling at each other, that tension, the synthesis recognizes and operates out of the wholeness that forced the necessity of the 2 sides, if that makes sense. And this is an old formula of the two things generating a third, and the third thing being the uh, the balance or the resolution of the apparent dichotomy of the two. The Tao begets the three, and the three, the 10,000 things. Not the Tao begat the two, and the two did all the work. That third element is there, and that's the mystery for humans. What is the third element? When everything breaks into a this and a that, what is that third element? And there's a different type of mental approach that reveals that third element. But we can't react, right? Because our reactions are going to put us into one of the first two, this or that. Our emotional reactions will always put us in this or that. Only this other type of mentation will lift us above this or that to see the table and the record player from above. And I think it's actually not just a different tuning, it might be a different energy state also. That something about my identity needs expression when I pick a this or a that.
Mhm.
I'm in the thick of it when I pick a this or a that. By identifying that third position and lifting myself out, I'm in an energetically different condition than when I'm tangled into this or that. This is why Lao Tzu says, between and how much difference is there really? He's kind of pointing to the unifying element that makes those two one. And that is the bigger picture. And you see that and are two sides of the same coin, right? So, maybe that caught between this and that, you are in the middle. And if you're in a materialistic universe, the odds are pretty good you're stuck between this and that. That is forced in that perspective of that normal disposition. And my argument is that making that shift out of that disposition to this newer place is just not a normal place for most humans. And so it's going to remain elusive until we really grasp it somehow.
Mm.
So does that help?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's all interesting. Maybe I want to stay on what you just said. Um, do you see kind of like the activities that humans are engaged in? And I guess the first one that comes to mind is AI development, just because that seems like uh, it's certainly quickly changing aspects of society, and how individuals relate to a variety of topics. So, but the question is, do you see activities that humans are engaging in positioning us for for more likely awareness of what you're calling like the third thing, or um, the ability to perceive reality in an integrative way or a post dual way, or like other than unbridled than your unbridled optimism. um, what do you see as evidence for this happening?
Oh, the nature of reality being that consciousness or awareness is fundamental and matter shapes up around it like that. So, in other words, it's the only game in town. It's the only place it can lead, which doesn't mean that every evolutionary uh, branch gets there. It means that you know this is again folks, if you have the kind of schedule, check out the reading of Creative Evolution by Henri Bergson on our audio bookshelf because he really goes into this. And uh, uh, I suppose it's impossible for me to rationalize my optimism without referring to experiences that I don't think other people have had.
Mhm.
I mean, some people have had, other people have had for sure, and they've written about it and said lots of stuff nobody else understands. Um, you know, so then the one both is and is not both the same and not the same as itself. Clearly, right? That's Parmenides to Socrates, right? Uh, you know, I think we went over Ibn el Arabi and a lot of the things that he said, and so there is some similarity about people who have made this dispositional shift and what they bring back to tell us about things. They use different languages, but what they say the same is far more interesting than the differences in their languages, you know.
Is
But
there
you see,
more
you
to
can't
say?
just take my word for all this.
Yeah,
That's the booby prize, right?
yeah, yeah. Um, is there? Do you have more to say about um, shapes? I just find that I'm finding that really interesting. Like shapes that end up having sacred meaning or having layers of meaning, or it's kind of like the code in the Bible is just kind of really fascinating, and I don't know much about it, but for example, that the letter Aleph, which is like the Greek alpha, the first letter of the alphabet, represents spirit, and so Adam, the first person, is represented by Aleph,
Spirit
and
as in consciousness.
yeah, and Dam
Notice how it
is
didn't start with matter.
yeah,
Aleph, they didn't pick matter as the content for Aleph, right? Right
right.
up there in the beginning, no
But I was just going to
ambiguity whatsoever. What
finish that
comes first? Yeah.
that Dam is blood, right? So Adam is spirit manifest in blood. Dam. So
Mhm.
that's just interesting because it sets up this like, oh well, what layers of meaning are manifest in how letters and words are arranged, in the Bible. Um, so yeah, shapes have kind of like this weird esoteric, like where did that shape come from, and why has it been around for thousands of years? Did you have any reaction to that?
Well, we get into yeah, there's a whole hermeneutical thing about that in, Truth and Method, where he goes in we're talking about the hermeneutical interpretation of art and history, and we you start looking at representation, basically, and, what is a glyph? What is a symbol? Uh, he gets into this is a variation of the conversation about a picture being different than, say, a reflection in a mirror. because the picture actually has its own existence. And by virtue of, like we said, every map chooses things to pick out and things to leave off. So a painting, the presentation of the painting is what makes it picturesque. Until someone paints it, it's not picturesque, right? As he gets into this. And the reason is because that painting, the way, and he goes back to Aristotle with that, the thing itself has a certain quantity of being. And when I make a representation of it, that representation has a being. And but that being is tied to the being of the thing it's a representation of. And since that thing has not lost any being by my making a representation of it, it's still ontologically what it was and intact. Therefore, my making a representation of it has actually increased its being.
Kind of like,
And
Plato's circle, like the idea of circle as opposed to the cup.
well, no, I think that this is more specific. That's the idea there is getting away from material stuff into the immutable. And this is about manifesting, like his argument is that my representation of a thing helps it be what it actually is.
Oh, got it. So there's like a magic component to this essentially.
A multiplication or expansion of being. Yeah, which is quite different. And which is different than, say, a reflection of the thing in the mirror. Or say I make a painting of which is the original is over here, but then I make a copy of it. Well, how does the copy of the painting differ than the painting of the reality, since they're both and he goes into the Latin roots behind representation, which is to make present again, right? So something about the original has to be brought to us, right? Well, so the long and short of a symbol or a shape is that, and there's a difference between a glyph and a symbol. So in one case, it's completely random and conventional. I say, okay, this shape uh, of a swirl is going to be associated with this product. And you easily could have picked another shape or another, and you've manually, as it were, made an association between those two. You think of a logo for a product. We've taken an image, and we want this image to represent our whole deal. But there might not be anything inherent about it that represents that. But if we look at like the yin and yang symbol, what we have is something that actually tries to show that this one thing has two components and that those two components switch with each other in a way, and each one contains the other within it. And again, it's like this the two have become more than they were. They imply the third, right? But it's actually graphically demonstrated in the symbol, which is different than a glyph, which is just, okay, this glyph is going to mean duck from now on. Right. And then other people will look at it and they'll go, huh, I wonder what that means. If it looks like a duck,
Mhm.
then the other people will be able to go, I bet it has something to do with ducks. Right. But if it just is this random glyph, there has to be some other association. And often they're phonetic. Right.
Mhm.
Well, we use the symbol that comes from this other thing that we use the sound duck for. But in this case, we modify it so you know that in this case, it's this other meaning of the sound duck, if you will, right? And so, that's the deal with a glyph and a symbol, is that we're trying to actually translate something into an image that contains the meaning in the image as opposed to just contains a convention we've agreed upon. So,
Mm.
for what that's worth. One is an embodiment and one is an attachment, you might say. Um, and you could say that the symbol actually represents because it makes present the principle that it's a symbol for. Whereas the word yin yang doesn't really show anything. It's just a random bunch of squiggles,
Mhm.
right? So that's the glyph symbol dichotomy there.
Mhm.
Um,
That's interesting. Yeah, I was surprised, in the conversation with David Marshall that we didn't I remember fishing around for kind of how is the American psyche reading the Tao Te Ching today different from the Chinese psyche that created it in ways that the American psyche today couldn't understand. And talking about kind of how Chinese language is organized, I would have expected to get um, more meat there. And I understand that's not his area of of inquiry. But it does seem like, for example, using a pictographic alphabet is going to have an impact on the psyche uh, compared to Americans using random squiggles to represent words. Like that's
well, and
going
it
to
also
generate
has
fun.
to do with the philology of derivations, so that cognates in ideographical languages are going to be different, maybe, than the cognates in phonetic languages,
Yeah, the
and
etymology. So
well,
so
and also, like just in the treatment that we've given to Heidegger, we've referred to a number of terms. Like I was thinking, well, Sorge was one of them, but and Besorgen, and there are words that are cognate in German that in English they're just not related at all, and that might be some of the, but I don't remember exactly what that meant um, in that setting. But there's that. There's also puns that play on the same sounds that aren't present on the paper. For example, one of the Chinese scholars was saying that, the choices of words that he made here, he had other choices he could have chosen, but he chose these. Well, you don't know how to assess that if you don't know those other words. And the argument, I think this was, let's check it. This is out of Red Pine's version, and he makes reference to a modern scholar, and I think this is worth talking about, maybe more will do, uh, whose name was Tuerway, and he talks about Tao originally meant moon. So the character for Tao has to do with the character for head and the character for moving, going. So he says what by coming out of its original association with the moon, you're talking about the phases of the moon as the face moves. And, you know, uh, uh, associating the Tao with that is a little interesting or a lot interesting because it has the implications of something, first of all, that only comes out at night. It's just not something you find in the clear light of day. So already we're into that meow, the mysterious, right? Which originally, back in the original days, didn't mean mysterious. It meant small, as in maybe hard to, where did that come from? Where did it go? Uh, so then the lunar references through word choice, uh, proceed. He proceeds to choose words according to this scholar's perception that all reinforce the lunar themes. of that. Well, that's the first I've ever heard of that, and I've read a lot of, scholars, but again, translating, it's one thing to look at the words on the page, and it's another thing to say, "Okay, there are these 35 words in common usage, and maybe a good 15 of them would be almost interchangeable. Why did he pick that one?" Without the extracurricular knowledge, if you will, you wouldn't even know to ask that question. And so these are all hermeneutical hurdles for sure. And again, this is where we have the trusting others or my self power. If I'm reading Lao Tzu and I am reading it as a piece of ancient literature that represents the foundations of Taoism, I read it with an interest in what is the most have what translation has the most fidelity to the original message that was written down. If, however, I'm reading it out of the myself power model, then I'm actually asking myself, what is he talking about? That is, now I'm not so focused on the talking, I'm focused on the thing that he's trying to communicate about. So it's like, do I wanna understand the roadmap to Boston so that I can get to Boston? Or do I wanna understand what this guy wrote on the map because his writing of it on the map is more important to me than Boston is? If I'm interested in that second problem is, is a scholarly issue. What did he really mean? What word did he really use? But if you're reading this because you have this theory that all the sages are talking about a dispositional shift to get a different experience of reality itself, and they all say a bunch of different things, then you read them all together like all different seats at the table around the phonograph record so that maybe you can't physically lift into that extra dimension, but you may be able to get a feel from what's the one perspective that would make all these true from their seat. Then you have a clue to that extra dimension. So so those are 2 different readings. Uh, when you and I might argue that there's even a third reading, and that is if you've started out by trusting others, you took some advice, you followed that advice to a method, you applied the method, and now you've gotten a result of that method. Now, with that result, you look back at the instructions. Now you look back at that, right? And it's the post facto interpretation as opposed to the a priori approach. And we all start in that a priori before experience, but we want to end up asking if hopefully from a posteriori, which is to say after some experience has been generated. You might recognize this. It's called the scientific method, right? Scientific method doesn't just say look around, it says do this and then look, right? And if you don't follow the injunction, which is the do this part, then your observations are going to be random. We want to get a relationship between the do this and the thing that results from the doing this. It's a relational connection we're looking to make. So, so yeah, I mean, this is why, for example, we're trying to make sense. We're not trying to make sense just of Heidegger or just of Lao Tzu or just of Thomas Aquinas or just of Ibn al-Arabi or just of Maimonides. But the idea, what we make the assumption that there is something consistent about reality and about humans and about the human pursuit of truth that they're all talking about the same thing on some level, but their seats are from very far apart places. Huge record player, millions of seats around this table, right? To blow up my my nifty metaphor beyond tenability probably, but you get the idea there that there's if we're looking for a universality, that's why I say, scholars will study two philosophers to understand the difference between them. It's very reasonable, very rational. Well, this guy says this, but this guy says this. I'm way more interested in the way that they're both saying the same things.
We're describing different parts of the same elephant. Yeah.
Same elephant. I've got the one elephant theory. And so whatever descriptions I get, I assume it's some part of the same elephant seen through the very particularized perspective of one seat at the phonograph table. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Cool. Very
So I
well.
think we got something uncovered from that. I hope we haven't done too much injustice to Mr. McIntosh.
Well, I maybe just one more disclaimer that I did absolutely do him injustice by kind of um offering a very small segment of what was a much more sophisticated argument. So
Right.
it is not a representation of what he said, but rather it got me thinking. What he said got me thinking, and
Yep.
that was um worth talking about.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I tried to uncover the ontological assumptions that seem to me like they must go along with that type of an argument as I understand it through a single proposition.
mhm,
So, yeah, I
yep,
think that's got all the qualifiers in there I can
yeah,
come up with.
good,
So,
and maybe he'll come on
fun.
the show and represent himself more fulsomely.
It would be interesting to do that. Yeah.
Yeah,
So any
good.
folks out there know him, rattle his cage for us.
Yeah, thanks, Brian.
We'll see you next time, folks.